guys. Tonight we're heading back to a time when love wasn't so much a feeling as it was a transaction, when marriage didn't start with flirting over bread and ale, but with ink on parchment and a nervous handshake between two families. We're in medieval Europe now, where romance was a luxury and marriage contracts were more binding than the laces on your boots. You're 7 years old. You've just stopped confusing spoons for swords, and now your father's leading you by the wrist toward a man you've never seen before. He's older, sun-browned, and missing a few teeth, but what really matters is that he owns 3 oxen and a plot of land with barley already growing. Congratulations. You're betrothed. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while we're settling in, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is. I'm curious how many of you are horizontal and half asleep already. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your name is whatever your father's land can support. Let's say Edmund or Isabel, or just, hey, you. It hardly matters to the contract. You live in a village with about 40 families, maybe 50 if you count the Miller's cousins. There's 1 road and 1 church and a lot of mud. You've got 4 pigs, 2 siblings, and an aunt who always smells faintly of soup and anxiety. The man your parents are talking to, he's from the next village over. He brought a goose as a gesture of goodwill and also, awkwardly, as part of the deal. The contract, yes, there is already a written agreement will eventually include the amount of land. Each side promises to the future household the livestock included in the transfer. Dowry arrangements will get there. Obligations for both families, penalties for breach of promise. And you, the child in question, are currently chewing on a bit of straw and trying not to sneeze. You're promised, not married. Yet. But this moment, the sponsalia de futuro, or promise of future marriage, is serious. So serious, in fact, that breaking it later might require the bishop's blessing, or a small army of lawyers. And in the Middle Ages, lawyers were often just priests who read too much. The adults smile and clasp hands. You've just been politically aligned. Let's pause for a second. Betrothals weren't necessarily binding in the same way as marriage, but they were considered solemn. Think of it like an engagement today, but with land at stake and livestock involved. Some kids were betrothed at birth, others at age 5. By 7, you were expected to understand the basics. Say yes, stand still, and don't eat the ink. You'd think the church might object. Actually, they love this stuff. Formality, structure, obedience. That's their jam. They insisted that technically both parties had to consent. But let's be honest, when you're 8 and your father says, "This is your husband," you don't exactly argue. You nod. You smile. You try not to cry, because your future spouse smells like cheese and you were really hoping to marry someone from the bakery family. Let's imagine the moment again, but this time from your betrothed's point of view. They're not thrilled either. They wanted to marry the smith's daughter, or that shepherd boy who has good teeth and a sense of humor. But no, they're marrying you because your parents have a small inheritance and their parents have a goat that can walk backward on command. Is it love? No. Is it strategic? Absolutely. Historians still argue whether betrothals were more about alliance than affection. Some say it was simply survival marriage as social insurance. Others argue it was pure economics, two families pooling resources to avoid starving through winter. The reality is probably both. But one thing is certain, your feelings had nothing to do with it. Fast forward a few years. You're now 12, or maybe 14. If you're a girl, you're probably considered marriage ready, because according to medieval standards, puberty equals adulthood. You've just started wearing a head covering, and people have stopped calling you child. If you're a boy, you've been told to start learning a trade, or more likely to keep plowing and stop complaining. The contract is being drawn up now, not by a lawyer, but by the village priest or a literate uncle or a scribe who charges by the word and spells Isabel 6 different ways on the same page. You're called to the table. The parchment smells like dust and ink. The quill scratches, and the words are dry and terrifying. Let it be known that the parties of the house of Gerwalt and the house of Brienne do enter into solemn agreement. You're in it now. It's not a wedding yet, but it's no longer a game. You've promised before witnesses. You've signed, or at least someone signed for you. And if either of you runs off now, someone's cow becomes forfeit. Yes, really, that's in the contract. You walk home in silence. Your mother pats your shoulder. Your father lights a candle. You lie in bed listening to mice scratch in the thatch above your head. And you wonder very quietly if you'll ever get to choose anything. You're not angry. You're not even sad. You're just adjusting to a life decided in ink by hands, not your own. Later, someone will ask if you remember the day you were betrothed. You'll nod. You'll say, it was raining. You'll say, he brought a goose. You won't mention the part where your fingers shook as you held the contract steady, or that you whispered too softly to be heard, I hope he's kind, because in medieval Europe that was about as romantic as it got. The rain hasn't stopped since the betrothal. Days bleed together beneath the same gray sky, and the roads through your village are little more than mud veins, now curling through sheep tracks and the flattened straw left behind by ox carts. You spend most of your time indoors, twisting flax, mending tunics, or helping patch holes in the thatch above your head. But your parents, they're busy negotiating the next part of your life, the dowry. Ah, yes, the word you've heard muttered over stew and whispered during church. Dowry. It sounds like a curse, doesn't it? But really it's more like a price tag. You see, in medieval Europe, a dowry was less about generosity and more about obligation. Your family doesn't want to give away their best linens, a cow, and a chunk of land, especially not to a family whose eldest son once stole your uncle's boots. But they have to, because without a dowry, you're as good as unmarriageable. So now your mother is quietly wrapping cloth bundles, some filled with coin, some with salt, one with a silver spoon that's been passed down for 3 generations and may or may not be cursed. Your father, meanwhile, is pacing, not because he doubts your worth, but because he's not sure if the ox in the back barn is going to make it through the winter, and if it doesn't, the entire contract might fall apart. You, of course, are still chewing on straw. That's your role in all this, to look presentable, to stay quiet, to be a good investment. Historians still argue whether dowries functioned more like insurance or tribute. Some say it was a way to protect the bride's future, her safety net, in case the husband turned out to be a scoundrel or simply inconveniently dead. Others insist it was a form of family bragging rights. Look at how much we're willing to give away just to join your goat-smelling bloodline. But from where you sit on a wooden stool near a fire that doesn't reach your toes, it feels like currency, a very personal kind of currency. On the other side of this arrangement, your future spouse is also facing pressure. If you're a girl, he's expected to prepare something called the bride price or mourning gift. It's his contribution to your future household. Maybe land, maybe coin, maybe just promises of things that don't yet exist, like sheep that haven't been born or a house that hasn't been built. If you're a boy, your parents are tallying up your value. Is your inheritance enough to cover the contract? Can your labor replace coin? Do you have at least one tunic without holes? These are the questions keeping medieval parents up at night. That, and whether your grandmother's will included any surprise debts. Spoiler, it did. The priest is back now, not for blessings, for bookkeeping. He's brought a quill and a hand so cramped from writing that it curls slightly, even at rest. He sits at the table, adjusts his robes, and begins to write the next part of your contract. This is the dowry clause, and it reads like a shopping list. Married a lawsuit. Item: 1 cow, 2 goats, 3 bed sheets of woven flax, and a copper cauldron of 27 fingers diameter. Each item is listed, valued, and given conditions. The cow must live at least 1 season. The goats must not be barren. The bed sheets must be free of rot fleas or stains, which frankly feels optimistic. Your mother interrupts once to add a small wooden chest with iron fittings, but only if the hinges are fixed. The priest nods solemnly and writes it in. You are technically present for all this, sitting 3 feet away, but you may as well be in a different room. This is the real marriage, the real ceremony, the one written in clauses, not kisses. That evening, the mood is lighter. A neighbor brought over cheese. Your aunt made stew. Your father even hums while sharpening a knife. But your mother, she's staring at the dowry list again, lips pressed tight. Not because she doubts your value, but because this marriage contract is the closest she'll ever get to negotiating power. And she wants to get it right. You help her pack. 1 dress of blue wool, 1 shift of linen, a veil passed down from a cousin who got married in the spring and was widowed by fall, a pair of shoes made from real leather, a belt with one good buckle, and 3 coins hidden in the hem of your cloak, just in case. Just in case you need to leave. Just in case he's not kind. Just in case the dowry fails to protect you. You hear later that the boy across the village was offered a richer dowry, 5 cows, a horse, a patch of river land with actual trout. He said no. His parents said no. They wanted your family, your name, your field. It turns out the man you're marrying isn't just a man. He's an alliance. And your dowry sealed it. You don't cry. There's no dramatic farewell. No midnight weeping into pillows. You are not a tragic heroine. You are a young person with responsibilities far older than you. And tomorrow you will walk down the same road as always. But this time you'll be walking towards something that already belongs to someone else. You're up before dawn again, not because you're excited, but because your mother insists it's time you learn how to bake bread properly. No daughter of mine, she says, dusting flour off her hands, will enter marriage with soft fingers and a burnt crust. You're not sure if this is about bread or something deeper, but you nod and knead anyway. The dough is sticky. The future is stickier. Outside, the village yawns. Smoke threads rise from chimneys, and oxen shift lazily in their pens. You glance out the window toward the road that leads to your betrothed's home. He's a blur to you, a shadow behind a name. You've spoken twice. Once during Lent when he offered you a cup of watered ale, and once when your little brother threw mud at his boots. Neither encounter inspired poems. But that's not the point. Love, you've come to understand, is not expected of you. Marriage in medieval Europe is a contract, not a courtship. And your signature is more your father's blessing than your own handwriting. Today's task is different. Your father is headed to the village square to finalize the livestock inventory portion of your marriage agreement. It sounds romantic, doesn't it? He's counting goats. You're counting blessings. Or trying to. The contract, still just a draft, is now bloated with clauses and stipulations. It reads like a farm inventory, mated with a legal scroll, and your family is determined to squeeze every ounce of leverage from your side of the pasture. Because here's the truth they don't say aloud. You are not the prize. Your dowry is. And your husband's family is evaluating you accordingly. Not your smile, not your thoughts, not your secret talent for whistling like a finch. They're interested in the number of hens your family owns, whether your mother spins fine flax, whether you can bear children. Spoiler, no one actually knows. But assumptions abound. And critically, if your land touches the barley field 3 plots over, if you're a boy, things aren't much different. You're being weighed against your family's inheritance, the sturdiness of your arms, and whether your cousin once got caught stealing apples, which sadly reflects poorly on your moral fiber. Historians still argue whether medieval marriage was truly emotionless. Some claim that affection often grew over time, like moss on a stone. Others believe romance was largely a poetic invention reserved for songs, not real life. Either way, love is not part of today's agenda. Today is about property. The goat is sick. This is not metaphor. One of the goats promised in your marriage contract has started limping, and your father is furious. He leans over the animal, muttering prayers and curses alike, trying to decide if a substitute pig would offend your future in-laws or elevate the deal. You sit nearby, weaving another length of linen, pretending not to hear the argument happening behind the barn. This was supposed to be simple, your father grumbles. Nothing simple, your mother replies, not when land is involved. She's right, of course. Because behind every medieval marriage is a silent game of strategy. Let's say you're from a peasant family. You have no titles, no banners, and your best claim to nobility is a rumor about your great-uncle rescuing a bishop's goat. Even then, the marriage contract matters. Why? Because marriage is how you survive. It's how your family avoids being absorbed by the neighbor who owns 2 plows and a suspiciously wide grin. It's how you secure winter grain and a backup place to sleep if your thatch collapses again. And it's how your children, future theoretical potato-faced children, might one day inherit more than just a wooden spoon and your grandmother's haunted comb. If you're from a noble family, everything scales up. Now, instead of a sick goat, you're talking about castles, estates, the right to graze sheep in the king's forest, which you definitely don't have, but you're negotiating as if you do. Marriages among the nobility are chess matches dressed as ceremonies. Entire counties changed hands this way. 2 12-year-olds staring awkwardly at each other across a cold hall while their parents sign away vineyards. And you just hope the shoes they give you don't pinch. Let's shift for a moment. Imagine you're the priest. You've seen 40 marriage contracts this year alone, and you've stopped pretending to care about romance. You care about wording, about seals, about making sure the document says, shall retain ownership in perpetuity and not until the first frost, because that mistake still haunts you from 1342. You ink your quill and adjust your robe. The couple isn't present, just their parents, but the parchment is real. The promises are real. And God, you hope the goats survive until next Tuesday. You wonder sometimes if anyone falls in love after all this. You doubt it, but maybe. You're back in your room staring at a small scrap of linen embroidered with your initials. It's the one thing you'll bring that wasn't negotiated, weighed, or cataloged. It's yours, truly. And that counts for something. You hide it in the folds of your cloak and imagine just for a moment that your future husband might one day notice it, touch it, and think of you with softness, not because of your dowry, but in spite of it. The rain eases, the goat lives, the contract survives, and so do you. Just a little older, a little quieter, and a little more ready for the ceremony that will bind you, not to a person, but to an arrangement. The church bells toll faintly across the valley, their echo carried on a low wind that smells like moss mud and a hint of something burning from someone's careless hearth. You hear the sound before you see the priest, the same one who drafted the contract, now walking up the lane with his worn satchel and a face carved by frowns. He's not here to bless anything today. He's here to inspect. And while you might think your marriage is a family affair, a private pact between two households, spoiler alert, the church disagrees. Oh, they disagree loudly. Because here in medieval Europe, nothing involving your future soul or your inheritance gets finalized without the church stamping its seal somewhere on your paperwork. You'd think they'd be more interested in sin or salvation, but no. Right now, they're focused on whether the contract used the phrase lawful issue or legitimate heirs. And if your cousin Gregor is allowed to stand as a witness, even though he drinks before breakfast. The priest sets up at your kitchen table like a man on a mission. He unfolds a scroll. He clears his throat. He begins asking questions, most of which aren't directed at you, because you're not the main character in this conversation. That role belongs to doctrine, and maybe the goat. Here's the reality. The medieval church loved marriage, but not for the reasons you think. Sure, they considered it a sacrament, a holy union, but they also saw it as a tool, a social glue that kept villages orderly and sin mostly in check. The church didn't care about whether you were happy. They cared about whether your marriage was valid. And that meant three things had to happen. You and your spouse both had to consent. The marriage had to be public. And ideally, it should be blessed, preferably by someone wearing robes and Latin vowels. You could technically get married just by exchanging vows in front of witnesses. That's right. No rings, no cake, no awkward dancing. Just a verbal, I will, and someone scribbling it down. But if you wanted it recognized by everyone, especially the church, which held terrifying power, then you needed the priest's nod. His nod and probably a coin or two for his effort. So now you're sitting beside your parents as the priest combs through your betrothal agreement, nodding at lines, grunting at misspellings, and occasionally muttering something in Latin that makes your mother whisper, "What did he say?" He's checking. The date of the contract must fall outside a holy fasting period. The ages of both parties, 12 for girls, 14 for boys. That's not a typo. The language of consent, phrases like, "I promise to take you," were required, and whether anyone has objected to this union on the basis of blood relation, previous marriage, or unresolved curses. Okay, maybe not curses, but definitely blood relation. Because nothing terrified the church quite like accidental cousin marriage. Historians still argue whether the church's strict marriage laws were about purity, power, or plain old paperwork. Some believe it was to prevent local nobles from hoarding alliances. Others suggest it was a theological strategy enforcing morality by inserting the church directly into your personal life. You meanwhile are wondering if the priest will notice that the ink on your dowry clause has smudged into something that might now say 2 goats and a slightly haunted chest. He does. And he raises an eyebrow. Your father panics, grabs a rag, and starts dabbing. Your mother blurts something about fixing it later. You try not to laugh, because it's the only part of this entire process that feels remotely human. The priest sighs, approves it anyway, and stamps it with his seal, a blob of wax pressed with a ring that smells vaguely of incense and finger sweat. Congratulations. You are now one sacrament closer to being someone's spouse. Later, your uncle pulls you aside and says, "When I married your aunt, we didn't even have a priest." You blink. He grins. Just said the words in front of a river and 2 cows. Been together 20 years. Not happy, but together. You ask if the church ever found out. He winks. Not yet. Not all marriages had priests involved. Some were clandestine, done in secret, or in places too far from parish centers. And those marriages still counted sometimes, even more than the flashy ones. In fact, the church spent centuries trying to control these quiet unions. By the 12th century, they began insisting on banns public announcements made on 3 consecutive Sundays before the wedding. The idea was to flush out secret lovers and any uncles who might shout objection from the back pew. So if your union wasn't announced blessed or witnessed, there might still be a wedding, but there would definitely be judgment. Your priest is finally satisfied. He rolls up his scroll, mutters a blessing over your hearth, just in case, and leaves behind a list of what will happen on the wedding day. A procession from your home to the church. The exchange of vows at the church door. Yes, outside where everyone could see. A blessing inside if you could afford it. And a post-wedding feast that may or may not involve juggling or soup. You nod politely, thank him and close the door behind him, then lean against it and exhale. The church may not care about your feelings, but it sure cares about your choices. Or rather, making sure they look legitimate. And tomorrow you'll sew your wedding tunic, memorize your vows, and pray that on your wedding day, it doesn't rain too much. The rain does return on your wedding day, but not with vengeance. Just enough to soften the ground to lay down a quiet hum as neighbors walk carefully down the path in their best wool cloaks, damp hymns brushing against reeds and brambles. Someone's brought a harp badly tuned. Someone else carries bread. No one smiles too much, but that's not unusual. It's a wedding, not a miracle. You've been awake since before dawn. Your mother braided your hair so tight, you can feel your thoughts straightening. She's pinned a sprig of dried lavender to your veil, muttering that it wards off bad luck and unclean spirits, which probably means your Uncle Bernard, who's already had 2 cups of ale. You're wearing your wedding tunic, a simple thing, dyed soft blue, stitched with your family's thread, and a surprising number of prayers sewn into the seams. You've worn better clothes on feast days, but none that carried so much weight. This tunic isn't for beauty, it's for legitimacy, a visible marker that you belong, that you're being transferred like property, but with embroidery. The church door looms ahead. If you're from a noble family, there might be flags, trumpets, a cleric who insists on reading 3 psalms before breakfast. If you're from a village like most, it's quieter, earthier. You and your soon-to-be spouse stand in mud, shifting awkwardly, as the priest clears his throat and holds up a book you can't read. And then he begins, right there at the threshold, because medieval weddings didn't begin inside. Oh no, they started outside the church door. That's where you exchanged your vows. In front of God the priest and anyone who happened to be walking by with a basket of turnips. Privacy wasn't the point. Public acknowledgement was. Marriage was a social contract, and visibility made it real. You say the words, "I take thee." And just like that, you're married. Not by magic, not by romance, but by pronouncement. Inside the church, if your family paid the fee, the priest will bless you, formally. Maybe even host a mass. This part feels more like a ritual, candles, Latin, awkward kneeling. You're not expected to understand much of it. Just bow at the right moments and try not to sneeze during the incense. Your spouse sits beside you. You still don't know what to say to them. They look nervous too. That helps. A little. You might think the reception would be joyous. And yes, there's food. That's the good news. You're not quite sure who made the stew, but it smells like rosemary and hope. There's bread, cheese, a jug of weak ale that goes warm too fast, but no one complains. The bad news. You're now the centerpiece of the celebration, and everyone's got an opinion. Your aunt pinches your cheek and asks how many children you'll have. Your cousin tells a story about a man who married his neighbor and lost all his pigs. Your grandmother whispers, "It'll get better." And you start to wonder what exactly will get worse. Somewhere in this blur of bread and speeches, your husband, yes, husband, now leans over and offers you the first kind word he's ever said. You look warm. You nod. Because you are. Mostly from nerves, but also from wearing 3 layers of wool in a room packed with sweaty optimism. Then comes the part no one likes to talk about, the bedding ceremony. Historians still argue how often this tradition was performed, whether it was formalized or merely whispered about. But one thing is clear, there was a cultural obsession with consummation. You see, marriage wasn't considered fully binding until you'd well sealed the deal. And to ensure that happened, some communities insisted on public gestures, parading the couple to the bedchamber, tossing them in together, and sometimes even standing outside to listen. Yes, really. If you were nobility, a priest might bless the bed. If you were a peasant, your cousin might just throw rose petals and shout, "Don't break the bed frame." Either way, it was deeply uncomfortable. And no one asked how you felt about it. Let's say your family is merciful. They let you slip away quietly. No crowds, no nudging. Just you and your new spouse alone in a drafty room, trying to ignore the creaking beams and the sound of laughter outside. You sit on the bed. The mattress is stuffed with straw and rumors. Your spouse clears their throat, and you wait, not for passion, but for proof. Because come morning, someone will ask if the marriage was consummated, not to be nosy, but to be legally sure. There are even stories, possibly exaggerated, but who knows of villagers inspecting the bed sheets. Let's not dwell too long on that. You survived the night. That's what matters, not whether it was tender or awkward, not whether you spoke at all. Just that you made it to morning and that the contract is now complete. You wake to a rooster's scream and your mother's footsteps. There's porridge and whispers and a quiet nod from your father that says, "Well done," without ever using the words. You are now a wife or a husband, no longer a child, not quite an adult, but something else entirely, a participant in history. You wash your face, braid your hair again, and open the shutters. Sunlight spills over a world that hasn't changed, but you have, because now you're part of a new household, a new lineage. And in the ledger of your village, between oxen births and roof repairs, someone has just written your name beside someone else's. Forever. The days after your wedding are oddly quiet, not peaceful, exactly, but quieter than you expected. There's no grand celebration, no parade, no congratulatory scroll from the king, just chores. The same wood to chop the same goats, to feed the same bucket that leaks slightly when you carry water from the well. You're in your new home now, if home is what you can call a one-room cottage with a sloped roof, a fire pit in the center, and two stools that wobble differently. One corner holds a bed stuffed with straw. The other has a table that leans away from the window like it's trying to escape the cold. Your spouse is here too, of course. They seem as unsure as you, which helps a little. You learn quickly that marriage is less about romance and more about logistics. Who feeds the chickens? Who mends the fence? Who apologizes when the butter turns sour? You learn that your body isn't entirely yours anymore, not in the dangerous, dramatic way of scandalous poems, but in the quieter way of expectation. You're supposed to produce something, children, mostly, but also bread and clean clothes and the illusion of contentment. And above all, you're expected to be obedient, especially if you're a wife. You see, in medieval Europe, marriage didn't just change your social status, it reshaped your legal identity, particularly if you're a woman. Your rights narrowed like a hallway in a stone tower. Once married, your name might stay the same, but your power didn't. Your property became your husband's. Your decisions became family decisions. And your silence, often praised as virtue. Historians still argue whether women truly lost all autonomy after marriage or retained subtle forms of influence through kinship whispers and the quiet economy of running a household. But you don't feel powerful as you scrape burnt porridge from the bottom of a pot. You just feel tired. If you're lucky, your spouse is kind. If not, well, the church says marriage is sacred, indissoluble, permanent. You can't divorce, not really, unless one of you dies, disappears into a monastery, or turns out to have married someone else by accident. And yes, that last one has happened, more than once. Annulments exist, but they're rare and expensive and involve long, painful interrogations about consummation and curses and whether you're technically cousins, even if your family tree looks more like a shrub. So you don't dream of escape. You dream of endurance, of learning how to thrive within the frame someone else built for you. You find moments, though, tiny human ones, like when your spouse laughs unexpectedly at your joke about the neighbor's chicken and nearly drops the firewood, or when you both wake in the middle of the night to the sound of thunder and for a moment you just listen together, wrapped in shared silence. You plant onions. You mend socks. You argue about how much barley to trade for salt. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, a rhythm forms. Not love exactly, but coexistence. There are rules for this phase of life. They're not written down anywhere official, but you hear them whispered over spinning wheels, carved into benches at market, and muttered between mothers and daughters when the bread rises too fast. Rules like, don't air your arguments outside. Don't visit your parents too often, it makes your spouse look weak. And never ever ask for more than what was promised. Marriage is about balance, not ambition. And ambition, that's a dangerous thing for someone without a title. Still, you can't help but wonder, is this it? Is this the life you've been prepared for since childhood? Endless days of counting chickens and pretending that bruises come from doors, not fists. You've heard stories of wives who ran away, of husbands who vanished into forests and reappeared years later with new names and new families, of women who took up weaving for coin and bought back their own dowries piece by piece. You tuck those stories away, not because you plan to follow them, but because they remind you that other endings are possible, even if they're not yours. Then there's the matter of children. Everyone expects them. They're not just blessings. They're proof of your fertility, of your usefulness, of your marriage's legitimacy. And if none come, the whispers start. Is it your fault? His? Or is God punishing someone? You try not to think about it, but every month you wait, and every month someone asks. Eventually, the village midwife visits. Not for a birth. Not yet. She comes to explain the rhythm of herbs, warmth, and rest. She carries a pouch of dried leaves, a crooked smile, and more knowledge than the priest will ever admit exists. She speaks softly. You listen harder than you ever have. And you wonder not for the first time how many women survive marriage by quiet rebellion, learning the secrets of roots and rituals while pretending to fear fire and brimstone. The days stretch. You age faster now, not from years, but from expectation. You're no longer someone's child. You are a household, a ledger entry, a cog in the slow-turning wheel of land and name and duty, and yet, on quiet nights, when the fire burns low and your spouse snores gently beside you, you trace your name in the ash near the hearth, just to remember that it still exists, even if no one speaks it aloud. The first frost comes silently crisping the edges of cabbage leaves and glazing the well handle with a thin layer of morning silver. You rise earlier now, not because you're eager, but because someone has to stoke the fire before the cold turns the room into a stone box. Your fingers crack in the dry air. Your breath clouds in front of your face. You wrap your wool shawl tighter, though it still smells faintly of turnip soup from 2 weeks ago. Your spouse sleeps on a lump beneath a quilt patched from old tunics and wedding linens. They've grown familiar, not a lover, in the songs you don't sing kind of way, but more like a fence post or a bucket, reliable, useful, occasionally in the way. You whisper their name just once. They grunt. Romance. Your life is now a cycle of seasons and expectations. You know what each week demands. Monday, wash the linens. Tuesday, scour the pots. Wednesday, trade eggs for candles. Thursday, endure your neighbor's complaints about her lazy daughter-in-law. Friday, help your spouse patch the thatch. Saturday, pray for market day to bring salt. Sunday, kneel, nod, and pretend the priest's homily on obedience isn't directed squarely at you. The rhythms are mechanical, but they carry the weight of centuries. Your life is not yours alone. You are living a version of existence passed down like an heirloom shaped by custom necessity and rules no one bothers writing down. And always, always, someone is watching. The older women in the village have eyes like hawks and memories like ledger books. They know who married whom, how many sheep each family lost last winter, and exactly how many loaves you offered at the last tithe. They speak in a shorthand of glances and raised eyebrows. You've learned to decipher it. You've also learned to play your part. Because if marriage is a contract, then daily life is the performance clause. But let's talk about property. Because if marriage is a legal structure, and it is then everything you own or think you own is part of the scaffolding, especially if you're a woman. In many places upon marriage, your dowry becomes your husband's property. It's not a gift, it's a transfer. A pre-packaged nest egg meant to support the new household, but often absorbed into larger family estates. That linen chest you loved, it's his now. Those goats you named, also his. Even your labor, your hands, your time, your bread are no longer yours. Historians still argue whether this loss of agency was total or negotiated. In some cases, women retained rights to their dowries. In others, especially among the peasantry couples, shared property in practice, even if not on paper. But law and custom rarely aligned cleanly. And you kneading dough with salt, borrowed from your neighbor, aren't debating legal theory. You're just surviving. Now suppose tragedy strikes. Your spouse, whether kind, dull, cruel, or absent-minded, falls ill. The kind of ill that doesn't fade after a good sleep and a steaming broth. You care for them, of course, because care is what you do. You feed, wipe, whisper, and pray. You chew bitter herbs and smear strange poultices on their chest, while the village midwife murmurs superstitions under her breath. And then, one morning, they don't wake up. Now everything changes, not because you grieve, though you might, but because marriage doesn't end cleanly, even in death, especially for women. As a widow, you enter an entirely new legal and social category. Some freedom, yes, but also new dangers. Your in-laws might claim your house. The church might question whether your marriage was valid. And if you're of childbearing age, everyone will ask if you plan to remarry, because God forbid you try to live alone. In some regions, widows were allowed to reclaim their dowries, or a portion of them. In others, you might keep the land only until a male relative needed it more. Either way, you are once again negotiable. And this time you don't have a father to bargain on your behalf, just yourself. Still, some widows carved out strange pockets of independence, running taverns, acting as midwives, even managing small plots of land if the church or Lord permitted it. You might find strength in your grief, not from loss, but from clarity. The world has taken what it wanted from you. Now it's your turn to decide what's left. You begin wearing a dark kerchief, not because anyone demands it, but because it signals something essential, that you are no longer under someone, that you answer to no one but God and the weather. It's a small thing, but powerful. Even the gossiping neighbors nod a little more politely now. Even the priest stops calling you daughter and starts using your name again. There are nights now when you sit by the fire and don't feel watched, when you stir a pot and don't worry who it's for, when you tuck your blanket tighter and let the quiet settle without expectation. Not all marriages were prisons. Not all widows are free. But for you, for now, there's air in the room, and that's something. You pull your shawl tighter. You look out the window. The frost has passed, and in the garden something green is pushing up through the earth again. Spring returns first, as a whisper, wet footprints by the hearth, a softening of the mud paths, the hesitant peep of birds that haven't been heard since St. Bridget's feast day. You keep your shawl near, but you don't wear it every day now. The sun touches your face earlier, and the windows drip less in the mornings. Your neighbors begin poking their heads out again like cautious hedgehogs. The baker hums as he kneads. Children throw rocks into puddles instead of sitting inside, chewing on leftover bread crusts. And the village slowly begins to turn over, just like your soil. You've been alone for several months now, and something strange is happening. People are starting to treat you with curiosity, not pity, not scorn, just that particular kind of attention reserved for widows of marrying age. You've seen it before, how the village's widowed women are approached by cousins, friends, and opportunistic strangers who claim to know the value of a steady wife, which roughly translated means they need someone to clean, cook, bear children, and smile during harvest feast. You are no longer newly bereaved. You are a free agent, which means, like it or not, you are back on the market. The offers come slowly at first. A bundle of leeks at your doorstep, a request for your apple pie recipe, a chance meeting at the well that includes an awkward story about someone's sick cousin and ends with a comment about your good posture. You do not swoon. You nod politely. You understand what's happening. Because marriage in medieval Europe, especially for widows, wasn't just personal. It was economic strategy. If you remarry, your property shifts again, your status changes. Your dowry, if you still have any of it left, might be renegotiated or supplemented, and any children from your first marriage must now navigate life in a blended household. Yes, they had those too. Medieval step-families were not uncommon. Historians still debate whether remarriage empowered women or simply reset the same cycle with new faces. Some widows gained land status or protection through clever remarriages. Others were pressured into hasty unions to keep male guardianship over their households. You are trying to decide which fate would be yours. You stir your soup slower these days, thinking, there's a man named Tomas. He's not cruel. He's not old. He brings you eggs every 3 days, even though you have 3 hens of your own. He doesn't speak in poetry, but then again, you never asked for poetry. He says your cabbages are growing well. You smile and say, I know. He asks nothing more of you that day, and that's why you remember him. In the meantime, your days are busy. As a widow, you're still expected to work. No one gives you a vacation for surviving your husband. If anything, the pressure is more intense. You must maintain your land, attend church, keep your clothing modest, and respond to all rumors with grace. And believe me, there are plenty of rumors. They say the blacksmith's wife saw you walking alone by the river. They say you hum while hanging linens, and that might be a sign of pride. They say you turned down an offer from the miller's son, and honestly, they don't blame you. You are not supposed to enjoy this freedom. But some days, you do. Then one morning the priest visits. He's gentler than before. Still smells like candles and old wood, but his tone has softened, as if he's finally realized you won't cry at the drop of a chalice anymore. He asks if you've considered remarriage. You shrug. He nods, understanding more in your silence than in any long confession. He offers a few scripture passages about duty and companionship. Then he leaves you with something practical. If you do remarry, be sure to have the contract copied by the scribe. And be certain both parties agree on the property terms. There have been issues. Ah, yes, the property terms. Because nothing says romance like a notary with bad handwriting. You dig out your late husband's contract that evening. The ink is faded, the seal half flaked, but the terms are clear. Your dowry was modest, your expectations clear, your rights barely acknowledged. If you do this again, you want more than a goat and a prayer. You want clarity. A few days later, Tomas returns. He doesn't propose. He doesn't pressure. He just asks if you'd like to walk to the field near the woods. There's a patch of early nettles. You could dry them for soup. You agree. Not because you need nettles, but because for the first time in months, you want to walk beside someone. And that's enough. On the way home, you ask him what he wants from life. He pauses, then says, "Not to sleep alone in winter." You nod. You understand that. You feel it in your bones. Not loneliness exactly, but the ache of having no one to tell you that the fire's going out. When you return, you sit on your doorstep and look at your hands. They're cracked, rough-stained from tending the hearth. But they are your own, still yours. You could give them to someone else, or not. And tonight, for the first time since your wedding, you realize you have a choice. That's a rare thing. Even in a world built on contracts and goats and whispered prayers, and it's something you'll carry carefully, like fire in a cold room. It starts with ink, not love, not roses, not even a proper courtship, just ink. Thick, smudged, barely dry ink scrawled across a coarse piece of parchment by a man whose fingers tremble from too much ale and not enough sunlight. He's the village scribe, a cousin of the reeve, and you're paying him in 2 salted fish and a measure of barley flour to write something more valuable than any poem, a marriage contract. You're doing this properly this time, not because your first marriage was improper, but because now you know better. Now you understand that words on paper are worth more than smiles at the altar. The contract includes the basics. Your name, his name. Yes, it's Tomas. The date, the season, the amount of land he holds, modest but fertile. The contents of your household: a bed frame, 2 hens, 1 table, and a woolen cloak passed down from your mother. You list it all, even the dented ladle, especially the ladle, because this time you're not letting anything disappear in the fine print of memory. The scribe asks if you want to include a dower clause, a provision for your support, should you outlive your next husband as well. You hesitate. Is it morbid? He shrugs. It's practical, and practical has become your favorite kind of romance. So you nod. Yes, write it. And he does, in shaky Latin, which you can't read, but you will ask someone to check it later. You've learned. You and Tomas don't have a grand wedding. No one does. The vows are said before the church door again, though the stones feel warmer this time, and the air smells like dandelions. No one sings, but someone brought bread, and someone else nods approvingly when the priest mumbles the words, "Let no man tear asunder." You and Tomas smile nervously but not unhappily. You feel older this time, not in your bones but in your knowing. There are no illusions, no pretense, just 2 people who are tired of sleeping cold and ready to tend a fire together. And that's the funny thing. The fire is warmer now. It might be the thicker thatch, or the better kindling, or maybe it's just that this hearth is yours, truly yours, because your name is on the contract, and your spoon is in the pot. And when Tomas sits beside you, he doesn't take up space like a tenant. He folds into the room like he belongs. You don't talk much at first, but when you do, it's about real things. When to shear the sheep, when to trade the last of the rye for salt, whether or not that mole near your shoulder looks like a bear or a poorly drawn fish. You laugh, not the giggle of a girl hoping to be liked, but the rough, full-bodied laugh of a woman who already is. You have more say now, not just in the kitchen, but in the village. Because widows who remarry well are watched with a kind of reverent suspicion. People ask for your opinion on disputes, on cloth, on recipes, on life. You're not the shy bride in borrowed blue anymore. You're the woman who chose her second marriage with eyes open, and that kind of choice is magnetic. You begin helping the midwife again, not because you need coin, but because knowledge, once tasted, demands more. You learn the properties of yarrow. You mix salves for rashes. You whisper blessings over cradles and carry hot water to women whose screams remind you that birth is another kind of contract written in sweat and sealed in blood. Historians still argue about how much medical knowledge women retained and shared, especially in the face of church skepticism and shifting legal codes. But in your world, healing is a communal act, and wisdom is passed down in fingers and murmurs, not scrolls. You soak it up like rain after drought. Then, one spring, a child arrives, not yours, but someone else's, left near the threshold of the church. A foundling, wrapped in linen, mouth open in silent sleep, fists clenched like he's already arguing with the world. You bring him home. Tomas doesn't flinch. He just asks, "What's his name?" You call him Leo, because he roared quietly at dawn before he even opened his eyes. And suddenly your house is louder, messier, fuller, not just in the physical sense, but in the way that a soul changes the air of a room. You never thought you'd raise a child again, but here you are, and you're not afraid. Children in medieval villages were often shared, nursed by neighbors, watched by cousins, scolded by everyone. The community raised them as much as parents did, and everyone knew whose child was allergic to onions or couldn't be trusted near ducks. Leo becomes everyone's child, but mostly he's yours. He tugs on your sleeves. He chews on your shawls. He calls Tomas Toe. And when he falls asleep on your lap, you feel something you didn't expect, hope. Not the foolish kind, but the quiet, durable sort that tastes like porridge and sounds like a child breathing softly against your chest. On rainy days, you look at the contract again. The ink has faded. The corners stained from soup, but it's still there. Your name, your terms, your life. Chosen, not given. And in this small, crooked house, with its mismatched stools and slightly sagging roof, you finally feel it. You are home. The year rolls on like a slowly turning wheel, and you begin to understand the deep rhythm of life, not as a series of sudden changes, but as something closer to breath, a long inhale, a long exhale. You wake each day with fewer surprises and More patterns chop, stir, gather, mend, listen. And in this predictability, this repetition, you find a kind of peace. Leo is bigger now, no longer a bundle of soft noises and spit, but a small force of nature with muddy hands and a voice that never seems to sleep. He talks to chickens. He steals bread crusts. He asks you if frogs are just wet mice. You tell him yes, not because it's true, but because you enjoy the wonder in his eyes. Tomas laughs more too, a deep throaty laugh that only appears when he's not thinking about it, usually after Leo calls him Toto, or when you drop an egg and pretend it committed treason. You've stopped counting the years since your first marriage. That life feels like another person's memory, someone younger, someone who didn't know to ask questions before agreeing to things. Now you ask questions. You read expressions. You speak your mind gently, but without apology. You're no longer the girl who accepted silence for safety. You're the woman who negotiates, and the village knows it. Your neighbors no longer call you widow or new wife. They call you by your name. They ask your advice, not because you're loud, but because your answers hold weight. You are respected, trusted, and that is rarer than love in a place like this. One afternoon, the Reeve arrives, unannounced, naturally. He's a narrow-faced man with a belt that creaks like a warning and a tendency to speak as if every word were a favor. Your contract, he says, it needs revisiting. You blink. Why? There's been a dispute. Someone's cousin is claiming land your Tomas inherited was improperly registered. Your marriage document might help clarify. You sigh. Not because it's bad news, but because you've kept the contract carefully tucked beneath your bread box for months, and now it smells faintly of rye and rosemary. You hand it over. The Reeve squints at the writing. Did you really write in a clause about keeping your mother's cloak? Yes. Huh. He doesn't mock you, just nods. And you realize something unexpected. He respects you. Historians often note that while women in medieval Europe had limited legal rights, many still wielded influence through meticulous record-keeping, strong relationships, and intimate knowledge of land and inheritance customs. In your case, it's not grand speeches or royal bloodlines that earn you power. It's that you remembered the clause about the cloak. It's that you had a copy. It's that you're careful. And in a world of men who forget their own grazing boundaries, that makes you dangerous in the best way. Later that week, Tomas repairs the fence. Leo tries to help and ends up tangled in twine. You untangle them both. When the sun sets, you sit on the stoop together. The horizon is pink, like bruised peaches. The air smells like freshly turned earth. Tomas places a hand on your shoulder. Doesn't say anything. He doesn't have to. You know this kind of silence. It's not the awkward hush of early marriage or the brittle quiet of mourning. It's something else, something shared. You remember your wedding day, not your first. The second, the better one. You remember the priest's soft voice. You remember the feel of parchment between your fingers. And you remember the exact moment you realized that life, while not always fair, could still offer choices. Even here, even now. There's a woman in the next village, over Agnes, whose husband left for pilgrimage and never returned. No death, no letter, just a void. She visits you, sometimes brings you clover honey and news of markets. You trade her eggs and advice. One day she asks if she can borrow your contract, just to look, just to understand how to write one for herself, should her husband never reappear. And she decides to marry again. You hesitate, then say yes, because women like you and her must build ladders for each other, out of paper, out of small decisions, out of stubborn survival. Historians still argue how widespread written marriage contracts were among lower-class villagers in the medieval period. They were more common among the merchant and noble classes, sure, but copies, oral agreements, and regional variants existed everywhere. What mattered most wasn't ink, it was understanding. And you now understand a great deal. Leo loses his first tooth. You bury it in the garden under the row of onions. He asks why. You tell him, so it'll grow into something strong. He nods, like it makes perfect sense. You smile, because it kind of does. When you go to bed that night, you stare at the rafters for a long time. Not because you're worried, but because you're thinking about how far you've come. From bride to widow, to wife again, to mother, to advisor. Your life is not grand. There are no ballads about you, but there are footprints where you walk, seeds where you plant, pages where your name lives next to the things you chose, and in the quiet between the crackling fire and the distant howl of a night dog, you finally breathe without flinching, because this is your life, your house, your contract, and no one can take it without asking now. There's a market day in late summer that smells like apples and sheep dung. You wear your best apron, still a little scorched at the hem from the time Leo thought firewood should be dry and on fire, and walk down the lane with a basket full of herbs and 2 jars of pickled turnips. Tomas carries the heavier load, wool skeins, dried mushrooms, a small pot of lard. Leo runs ahead, nearly tripping over a goose, laughing like this whole dusty world belongs to him. It kind of does. You reach the market square and feel something you haven't felt in a while. Ease, not joy, not excitement, just that rare medieval luxury of knowing, if only for a moment, that no one is looking to take something from you. No debts, no rumors, no sickness this week. Just sun on your face and the low murmur of bartering. You pause at a table stacked with scraps of parchment, some with crude drawings, some blank, some with pieces of old prayers half smeared into nothing. A boy watches you, picking his nose with one hand and guarding his papers with the other, like they're gold. You buy one, not because you need it, but because you want to write your name. Just once. In the middle of a market with people bustling and calling and asking if your hens are laying yet. You borrow a quill, dip it into ink so black it could be night pressed into a jar, and you write Agatha there on a crumpled bit of goatskin. Nothing fancy, no flourishes, but it's yours, just like the contract, just like the house, just like the boy yelling your name from the bread stall. Historians still debate how many peasant women could read or write in the 14th century. Literacy wasn't expected, but it wasn't impossible either, especially for women tied to clergy families or those who worked near record scribes or monks. But forget the statistics. You can write your name. That's all that matters today. Tomas buys a small wooden comb for you. He pretends it's for Leo, but it isn't. He places it in your hand, calloused fingers against your palm, and says your hair's been getting longer. You nod. I know. You don't say thank you. You don't need to. Some gestures are old and quiet like river stones. They just settle where they belong. You sit under the old oak near the edge of the market while Leo plays with a stick and a piece of string, pretending it's a hawk on a leash. You comb your hair, carefully, slowly, each stroke a small spell, because even in a world of dust and goats and chapped hands, there is still room for softness. Later, the sun dips low and people begin packing. Tomas trades your wool for salt and your herbs for oil. You walk home with fewer goods, but lighter shoulders. Leo falls asleep in your arms, halfway back. You don't mind the weight. You remember when your arms were empty. You remember when your house was quiet. You remember when your name wasn't written anywhere. The next day, you tack that parchment to the inside of your cupboard door. Just your name. Just Agatha. In shaky ink. But every time you open it to grab salt or a spoon or the knife with the good handle, you see it. And it says, I'm here. I lived. Then a storm comes, late at night. The wind howls through the thatch. Water creeps under the door. The chickens panic, and so does Leo, half dreaming and sobbing in the dark. You and Tomas move in silence. Buckets, blankets, a steady hand on Leo's back. You tell him the roof will hold. He asks how you know. You don't, but you say, because I built it. And he believes you, because he's never seen you lie. And you don't start now. Morning brings mud, everywhere, but no loss. The fence held. The food stayed dry. The roof still stands. You press your hand to the wall and thank it softly, as if the house hears, because maybe it does. Later that week you find a dead crow at your doorstep. Ominous, some would say, but you know better. You bury it near the garden, sprinkle rosemary over the grave, and whisper a blessing, not for fear, for rest. The world is harsh enough without dragging anger into the soil. Historians still argue whether common folk really believed in omens, or whether they simply played along for custom's sake. But you know there's power in ritual. If not to change the world, then at least to change your grip on it. And that's enough. You begin drying apples for winter. Leo helps, sort of. He eats more than he slices. Tomas builds a new shelf in the corner of the house. And you begin a second contract. not with a man, but with yourself. You write in careful, halting script, I will not be invisible. I will keep what is mine. I will remember the names of those who gave me peace. And I will leave a record. You fold the paper, tuck it under your mattress, and sleep easier that night. Not because anything's perfect, but because you've put something into the world with your own hand. And no one can take it away. The days shorten again. Not suddenly, not like a trap closing, but gradually, like a candle burning down too low to notice, until the room feels smaller. The morning air nips your fingertips. Your shawl returns to its place on the peg by the door. You measure flour more carefully, salt more slowly. Winter is coming again, but this time you're not afraid. Because this time you're prepared. There's oil in the jar, dried apples on the shelf, and more than enough wool for socks and mending, and a new pair of mittens that Tomas insists are not too small, even as they squeeze his knuckles like gossip. Leo draws pictures in the frost on the window, mostly chickens, sometimes wolves. You tell him wolves don't come near your house anymore. He says it's because they're scared of your stew. You agree, and he laughs. The village is quieter now. Fewer people in the square. More creaking from carts and groans from the oxen pulling firewood through mud. You pass neighbors with nods, not words. Everyone is storing energy, conserving light, folding themselves inward like sheets in a chest. You spend more time at home, but the house does not feel small. It feels full, full of the things you've chosen and the people who stayed. One evening, you find Tomas near the fire holding your first contract, the one with the cloak clause. He looks at you and says you were smart. You shrug. I was cautious. Same thing, he says, and kisses your forehead like it's the most natural thing in the world. It is. Now, you begin teaching Leo letters, one at a time, slow as butter melting. He learns to draw an A with pride, though it looks like a three-legged stool having a tantrum. Still, it's a beginning. And beginnings matter, even in winter. Historians still argue about how often children in peasant households received any formal learning, but informal education. That was constant. Children learned from watching, from listening, from doing. You teach Leo how to measure barley, how to boil nettles for tea, how to sew a button back on when it tries to escape. He teaches you that the best way to keep warm is to pretend you're a bear and growl under the blankets, which, to be fair, works surprisingly well. One morning the village wakes to snow, real snow, not the dusting that whispers on rooftops and disappears by noon, but the thick, heavy kind that silences everything. You step outside into a world muffled in white, holding your breath, not from cold, but from awe. Even the outhouse looks beautiful today. You return inside with red cheeks and a smile you don't notice forming. Leo claps his hands and says, "Snow day." You say, "Every day's a snow day in winter." But you hand him the last apple anyway, just because. The fire becomes a ritual, not just warmth, but ceremony. You wake and check the coals. You sleep only after the last flicker dims. You and Tomas take turns, tending it unspoken shift smooth as breath, and sometimes in the quietest part of night you sit by it, alone, not lonely, just present, thinking of your name written on goat skin, thinking of your mother's cloak still hanging in the corner, thinking of your life stitched from salt and smoke and paper. The church bells ring one morning unusual for this time of year. Someone has died. You don't ask who, not yet. But later, you walk to the edge of the village and see a small gathering near the chapel. You recognize the figure draped in wool. It's the blacksmith's mother, old, kind, once whispered a blessing over your house after your first husband's funeral. Now she's gone. You cross yourself, say her name aloud, just once, and keep walking. Because sometimes grief is not yours to carry, but memory is. At home, Leo asks where snow comes from. You say, the sky forgets how to cry, so it sends down silence. He doesn't quite understand, but he nods anyway. That's enough. You make a new list that night, not on parchment, just in your mind. A list of the people who've helped you, a list of the things you've kept, a list of the lessons that made you stronger. And a final note. If I die in winter, make sure the fire stays lit. You don't write it down. You just tell Tomas. He nods. You won't die in winter, he says. You smile. You never know. I do, he says. And somehow, you believe him. Later, as the wind howls outside and the fire cracks like a tired knee, you sit at the table and teach Leo one more letter. It's an L, his favorite, because it starts his name. He draws it crooked, then straight, then backwards, then perfectly. You kiss the top of his head and say, that's how we start a word. What word, he asks. You pause, then say, love. And for the first time, he doesn't giggle. He just keeps drawing. That night you dream of snow falling inside your house, not cold, but soft, weightless. Each flake carries a word. Some are your name. Some are stories. Some are just letters waiting to be joined. You open your hand, catch one, hold it close. It melts into your skin, and you wake not with fear, but with peace. Because even in winter, even in a world without guarantees, you've written yourself into something lasting. And tomorrow, you'll write again. Spring never announces itself in a grand parade. It sneaks in, tentative and muddy, a drip from the eaves, a dampness in your socks, a bird you haven't heard in months, singing like it never stopped. You open the door one morning and smell something unmistakable growth. It's not flowers, not yet. It's the scent of thawing earth, of roots, waking up, of wet bark, stretching after a long nap. Leo finds a worm in the garden and declares it his best friend. You bury your hands in the soil and laugh because somehow that feels about right. Tomas builds a small bench outside. No one asks him to. He just does. You sit there together, in the mornings now, watching dew bead on leaves and steam rise from your tea. No words needed. The bench creaks beneath you like an old friend joining the conversation. You're planting again, the same seeds, but with a new rhythm. You know which rows stay dry too long. You know which weeds lie in wait like little green con artists. You hum while you work quiet tunes your mother once sang when the sun was just right and the world hadn't disappointed her yet. Leo helps plant onions. He names each one. You don't correct him. Some magic isn't meant to be questioned. Then comes the letter. It arrives wrapped in twine, smudged with dust, and sealed with wax that's cracked from travel. You haven't received a letter in years. It's from your cousin, the one who married a merchant in the next town over. She writes of sickness, of loss, of needing help. You fold the letter carefully and sit with it for a while. Tomas doesn't ask what it says. He just asks, "Do we need to pack?" You nod. Historians still argue whether women in rural villages traveled often. The assumption is they didn't. But letters like this urgent, familial, desperate move people, especially women who remember what it's like to need a place to land. You leave Leo with a neighbor who makes excellent cabbage pies and tells wonderful lies about pirates. You and Tomas walk 3 days through forests still wearing their winter bones, across creeks pretending to be rivers, over fields that sigh beneath your boots like they're grateful someone came back. When you reach your cousin's home, it's smaller than you imagined. And she is thinner than you remember. She cries at the sight of you, and the weight of that hug feels like lifting a fallen beam. You stay for a week. You clean. You cook. You patch her roof and her curtains and her silence. You read her husband's last note aloud because she can't bring herself to say the words. You sleep on straw that smells of lavender and mice. You don't complain. You teach her daughter how to mend a seam and her son how to slice onions without crying. He still cries. Before you leave, she presses a coin into your hand. You try to refuse. She says, "Let me do this. Let me thank you." You let her. Because sometimes the most generous thing you can do is allow someone to give. You return home sore and satisfied. Leo tackles you at the gate. He says he missed you more than stew, which is high praise. You unpack slowly. Tomas brews tea, and everything settles again, like flour in a jar, like silence in a chapel, like shoulders releasing the day. That evening, you pull out your contract again, this time not to review, but to add. You write, "Left the village, returned, helped a sister, came back whole," and below it Leo adds a drawing. It might be a horse, it might be a fish, but you pretend it's a horse and he beams. The seasons move faster now. You blink and there's barley to thresh. You sneeze and the leaves have turned. You age quietly. Your knees don't bend like they used to. Your knuckles crack before you speak. But your mind is sharper than ever. sharper than the knife Tomas finally agreed to replace. You begin teaching other women to write, just names at first, then numbers, then little sentences like spells. I am here. This is mine. No one may take it from me. You show them how to fold the parchment, how to store it somewhere only they know. You do not call it schooling. You call it remembering, because that's all it really is. Historians still argue how much agency peasant women truly had. Laws and customs often worked against them, but within those walls, within those rules, women carved out spaces, pages, voices, and you've become a kind of archivist of the ordinary, a keeper of stories never meant for the court, but vital to the kitchen. One night Tomas asks what you're writing. You say, a list. He says, of what you smile. Everything I don't want forgotten. And he doesn't laugh, because he knows. He's watched you remember things no one else bothered to. He's seen how you speak names with reverence, how you preserve details like pressed herbs. You write the taste of honey on black bread, the crack in the door that looks like a fox, the sound of Leo's voice saying, again, before stories end. The name of every woman who taught me something useful, the exact weight of relief. You fold the page, place it next to the contract, and go to sleep, not because the day is done, but because you've saved something worth waking for. The years begin to layer like linens in a trunk, soft, a little faded, but still warm. You don't notice the passage at first, not until Leo stops calling for you in the night, not until he starts walking further into the woods without asking permission, not until he comes back one day with a small rabbit and a smile too wide to scold. You cook the rabbit with rosemary and vinegar and call it a feast. He calls it mine and insists on blessing the meal. You let him. You've started waking before the sun now, not from worry, just from habit. The kind of quiet that lingers before dawn is sacred. The fire hasn't yet cracked. The roosters haven't remembered their duties. Even Tomas sleeps in stillness. You sit at the table with a cup of broth and a candle stub, and you write, not for anyone else, not even for memory this time. You write just because the pen still fits your hand. Sometimes it's letters you'll never send. To your first husband, to your mother, to a future version of Leo, who might forget that you once taught him how to sew on a button and how to fake a limp when he didn't want to chop kindling. You write down the joke Tomas made yesterday about the neighbor's goat and how it backfired when the goat followed him home. You write that you laughed so hard you snorted, and that you still feel embarrassed about it, even now, even here. And you begin to feel something that surprises you, contentment, not the loud kind that demands notice, but the slow spreading kind that lives behind your ribs and shows itself when you exhale just right. You have enough, not much, but enough. And enough is everything. One market day, you find a scrap of purple cloth, too small for anything useful, too soft to ignore. You buy it. No reason, no plan, you just want it. That night you hem the edges and make a pouch for your contract. It slips inside perfectly, The ink is faded, yes, and the edges are frayed, but the words are still there, still yours, still waiting. Historians still argue whether personal documents mattered in the daily lives of medieval peasants. Legal codes often ignored women entirely, and written proof was rare. But even so, you know something many don't. What is written can't be denied as easily. Your contract has spoken for you more than once, and you trust it to speak again if ever needed. You begin teaching Leo how to sign his name. It's not easy. He gets frustrated, says the letters look like squashed worms. You say that's the point. He calls you weird. You say, exactly. Spring returns, then summer, then another round of harvest. Tomas hurts his back, lifting a sack of barley, and you scold him until he laughs. You tell him he's not young anymore. He tells you, neither are you. You both pretend to be insulted. You both know it's true. You both know it doesn't matter. The neighbor's daughter gets married. A modest ceremony, but you're asked to help prepare the feast. You bring pickled onions, 2 cakes, and a quiet blessing folded between them. At the wedding, you hear the priest read from a contract. You recognize a phrase, something you'd once written in your own. You smile. The bride winks at you from across the table. A new woman, a new page, a continuation of what you once started with a piece of goatskin and stubborn hope. Leo carves his initials into a tree. You ask why. He says, so people know I was here. You nod. That's a good reason. He pauses. Isn't that what your contract is for? You don't answer right away. You think about all the reasons you wrote it and how it's changed, how you've changed. Then you say, it's so I know I was here. He tilts his head thinking, then says, I'll write a contract one day too. Good, you say. Will you help? Of course. He leans his head against your shoulder and says, mine will be longer than yours. You grin. I hope so. Later that evening, Tomas pulls out an old stool and sits beside you at the fire. He watches the flames for a long time, then says, I never told you this, but I was scared when I first met you. You raise an eyebrow. Why? Because you asked for things. You knew what you wanted. You laugh. That scared you? It still does, he says, smiling. But now I like it. You don't say anything for a while. Then, good. Outside, the wind picks up. It smells like dry leaves and distant rain. Inside, the fire pops. Leo snores softly in the loft, and you reach for your pouch, the purple one. You pull out the contract, unfold it carefully, and for the first time in years, you don't add anything. You just read it, silently, slowly, gratefully. Because this life, though not grand or easy or clean, has been yours. You chose it. You built it. You named it. And you remembered it. Historians may never write about women like you, but you did. And that's more than enough. There's a day late in autumn when everything feels still. Not quiet like sleep, but still like breath held just before a word. The leaves have mostly fallen, but the ones that remain cling like old memories, golden rust red and curling at the edges. You sweep the path in front of your home, not because it needs it, but because the rhythm feels good, because it lets you think. Leo helps sort of. He swings the broom more like a sword. You let him. There's time enough ahead for him to learn straight lines. Inside, the smell of onions frying in oil wraps around you like a blanket. Thomas is making stew, and it's too salty already, but you won't say anything. You'll just add a potato later, and he'll pretend not to notice. You sit down with a small bundle of scraps, pieces of wool, bits of parchment, a dull needle, and thread that's been reused twice too many times. It's mending day, but you're not fixing shirts or cloaks today. You're fixing the pouch, the purple one. It's fraying at the corner. The thread's loose where Leo's sticky hands have tugged it too many times, asking, "What's inside?" You told him once it was your whole life, and you weren't lying. You take the contract out, not to write, not even to read, just to hold. The ink is nearly gone now, just faint shadows of words once bold. But you remember every line, every promise, every little fight it won for you. Every time someone saw that scrap of parchment and paused, reconsidered, hesitated just long enough for you to stand taller and speak a little firmer. You stitch the pouch carefully. Double knot each end. Fold the cloth over twice. And as you finish the last stitch, you whisper, "Thank you." To the paper, to the pen, to the girl you used to be when you wrote it. Historians still argue over how common it was for peasant women to carry documents. They question whether it was practical or even possible. But you know better. You've lived better. You've carried your past, your voice, your rights in your apron pocket for decades now. It's not just paper. It's a weapon, a witness, a friend. Tomas brings you stew proudly, claiming it's perfect. You take a bite and nearly choke on the salt. He watches your face. "Well," he asks. "It's strong," you say, diplomatically. He laughs. "That's just how I like it." You offer him a slice of bread to go with it. He accepts. Balance, like everything else in marriage, is often about bread. Leo asks to hear the story of your contract again. He asks often these days. Tonight he sits at your feet with a bowl in hand, legs crossed, eyes wide. You tell it again. How you walked to the scribe's house. How you argued with a man who didn't think you'd understand the law. How you signed your name even though your hand shook. How that paper gave you back your house and your name. He listens, nodding like it's a fairy tale. Maybe to him it is. You hope someday he tells it to someone else. He's growing fast now. His voice is deeper. His feet are almost the same size as Tomas's. You've begun teaching him numbers beyond the market stalls, how to reckon interest, calculate storage, and keep track of borrowed tools. He complains, but not much. He likes knowing. Knowing things is power. You learned that the hard way. The priest asks you to help with records this year. You say yes, cautiously. The village hasn't always trusted women with ink, but times are shifting, gently, and you're no longer the woman who whispers her own worth in the shadows. You sit at a table in the chapel, copying names and births and debts owed to the church. Your handwriting is slower now, but it's neat. Tomas stops by with lunch one day. He doesn't speak, just leaves a slice of hard cheese and some apples, then nods and leaves again. Later, you find a note tucked inside the cloth. You're better at this than the priest. You smile. It's the highest praise he's ever given. One evening, the wind rattles the shutters hard. The fire flares, then dies down. You and Tomas secure the windows while Leo checks the animals. The rain hits hard, pounding like fists on the roof. And through it all, you sit at the hearth clutching the pouch, not from fear, from habit, from gratitude. Because no matter what storm comes, you know who you are. You know what you've earned, and no one can unwrite it. Historians still argue whether peasant women like you understood the power of their own stories. Let them argue. You're too busy living yours. You prepare for winter again. You've done it so many times now, you could do it blindfolded. The barrels are full. The herbs are dry. The house smells like thyme and pine. You find a new jar of ink at the market, not because you need it, but because it's the good kind, the kind that doesn't smudge and smells faintly of metal and ash. You buy it. You carry it home like a treasure. That night by the fire, you test it. One letter, one name, yours, and it shines, just for a moment, but long enough. You store the pouch again, carefully, back into its place between the old blankets and the bundle of dried lavender. You place your hand on it and close the chest. You whisper, not loudly, not for anyone else, I was here. And that's enough. The first frost arrives earlier than usual. It dusts the edges of your window like powdered sugar, fine and cold and startling. You press your fingers to the glass and feel the season turning in your bones. The fire groans as Tomas pokes it awake. Leo is still asleep, arms flung wide like he's dreaming of flight. You stay still for a moment longer, letting the cold seep into your thoughts, anchoring you. You were never meant to live this long, but here you are. You light a candle and open the chest. The pouch lies there, obedient as ever. You don't open it. You just look, then close the lid again. Some mornings don't need words. Thomas makes porridge too thin, and you add flour when he's not looking. He calls it a new recipe. You don't correct him. There's comfort in letting someone believe they've created something, even if it's just breakfast. Leo finds a bird with a broken wing. He names it Smoke and insists it will fly again. You help him make a little cage from leftover wood slats and old netting. Every morning he checks on it, talks to it, tells it stories. You envy the bird a little. It doesn't understand the stories, but it still gets to hear them. It's a kind of luxury. The church wants to buy part of your land. It's not a surprise. They always ask when things seem quiet, when they think you might be tired enough to agree. They offer coin and promises. You offer a polite no, and when they press, You don't argue. You just walk inside, fetch the contract, lay it on the table. Say, "This land came to me lawfully. It will leave only when I say so." They stop pressing. Historians still argue whether women had formal ownership of land in your time. Most say no. Some say only widows under specific conditions. But few account for the sharpness of memory, the weight of paper, the fear in a priest's eyes when a woman speaks clearly and without apology. You own this land in every way that matters. Smoke's wing heals in time. Leo opens the cage one morning, unsure. The bird hops, flaps, pauses, then rises like a question finally answered. He cheers. You watch in silence. There's something sacred in that kind of flight. Not the distance, just the fact it happened at all. You start a new ledger, not for crops, not for debts, but for names. You begin writing the names of every woman who's come to you for help, with mending, with words, with fear, with contracts of their own. You don't title the book, just record, line by line. Some names are simple, some are long. Some include a note lost. Her first child survived the storm, laughed when she was supposed to cry. It's not history, not yet. But it could be. One evening, Tomas sits beside you with a piece of parchment. He says, "I wrote something." You blink. He's never done that before. He hands it to you. It's short, a few lines, simple handwriting. It reads, "If I leave before you don't burn the chair by the fire, don't stop writing. Don't forget the sound of our house in winter. And don't you dare let anyone take the land. It's yours. Always." You cry. Not loudly, just enough. Then fold the paper and slip it into your pouch beside the contract. You don't say thank you. He knows. The snow returns, as always. But it falls slower this year, like it respects you now. Leo is nearly grown, taller than you, stronger than Tomas. But he still kisses your cheek when no one's looking. Still sits too close when he's scared. Still asks you questions about things he already knows, just to hear your voice answering them. You cherish every one, even the repeated ones, especially those. One night you hear laughter from the loft. Leo and Tomas playing some game with stones and made-up rules. You don't interrupt. You just listen. Let the sound soak into the walls. Let it settle into the floorboards. Let it become part of the house, like heat, like silence, like memory. Historians still argue what medieval houses were really like. You could tell them, but they wouldn't believe it. They'd expect dirt and darkness and roughness. And yes, there was that, but also candlelight and mended skirts and soup with too much time and a boy learning how to be a man without forgetting how to be kind. You write a new clause for your contract. Just one line. If anything of mine is remembered, let it be that I said yes to what mattered. You seal it with wax. Your wax, not the church's. You press your ring into it and let it dry, then tuck it away, back into the purple pouch, where it belongs. Outside, the stars are brighter than they've ever been. You wonder if they always were, and you just never had the time to look. You step outside into the frost, breathe in deep, and exhale. Not because something ended, but because everything stayed. The firewood pile is shorter this winter, but your patience is longer. You find yourself stirring stew more slowly, letting the flavors bloom, letting the quiet fill in the gaps between each bubble of heat. The floor creaks under your steps in the same places it always has, and somehow that's become a kind of comfort too. Leo chops kindling now, without being asked. You pretend not to notice how carefully he arranges it, just like you used to. Neat, tidy, like it matters. Because it does. You begin waking with aches. They migrate shoulder hip back, but never quite leave. Tomas rubs your arms when the mornings are cold, and you tease him about his rough hands. He smiles and says, "You used to like them." You still do. You just don't say it out loud every time. That's how aging works, more feeling fewer words. A letter arrives in early spring. This time it's not about loss or need. It's from a woman you once helped a girl, then frightened and hunched, asking how to write mine without spelling it men. She's married now, with land. She enclosed a tiny drawing of her house. 2 windows, a slanted roof, and a chimney drawn in crooked ink. At the bottom she wrote, "I made them sign it, just like you said." You cry for a long time after that. Quiet tears, the kind that feel like proof you were useful. Historians still argue about whether poor women influenced laws in medieval towns. They cite noble women, queens, abbesses, but they miss the tiny movements, the whisperings, the corrections, the stubborn ink that refuse to be erased. They miss women like you. But maybe that's the point. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just plants itself in the earth and grows slow and unnoticed until suddenly it shades everything. Leo brings home a girl, not a wife, not yet. Just someone with soft eyes and hands that don't flinch around animals. You make her tea. She compliments the rug you made 5 winters ago, and you almost love her for that alone. Tomas says nothing but watches her eat with a kind of silent calculation. You whisper later, "She's kind." He shrugs, then adds, "And she didn't salt her soup before tasting it." That's his version of approval. You show her your pouch. She doesn't ask. You just do it. You lay it out on the table and let her see the seams, the faded ink, the wax that's cracked but still clinging. She runs a finger over it, slowly, like touching a page of scripture. Then she says, "I didn't know women could do that." And you say, "They can." She asks, "Do they?" You think about that, then answer, "When they're ready." Later, you find her sitting with Leo under the tree with his old carved initials. They're holding hands, not tightly, just enough. You go back inside. Let the moment breathe without you. Some silences deserve space. A storm rolls in. Not the kind with wind and rain, the kind with fever. Tomas falls first, then Leo. You do what you can. Broth herbs, whispered prayers, folded into damp cloths. You sit by their beds and read from your ledgers, not because they're listening, but because the sound of your voice keeps you calm. You don't sleep. For 3 days. You don't eat. You just wait. Then the fever breaks. For both. You weep into the soup bowl. No one notices. You're glad. The girl, her name is Mira, helps without fuss. She cooks better than you expected. You start calling her daughter by accident. She smiles when you do, doesn't correct you. You add to the ledger, Mira daughter, not by birth, but by kindness. You think about adding her to the contract. You hesitate, then do, because names matter, even borrowed ones, especially borrowed ones. Historians still argue about inheritance customs. Who could claim what counted as family? But the heart doesn't wait for a notary. It just decides. And sometimes the parchment follows. Sometimes it doesn't. You've lived long enough to know the difference. One morning, Mira brings you a basket of early greens. You're sitting outside, a blanket around your shoulders, watching the frost melt off the edges of the roof. She says, "You taught me without teaching." You laugh and say, "You listened without being told." And somehow, that feels like a promise, sealed in wax. Tomas plants onions. He says they always remind him of the early days. You joke, the ones where we barely spoke. He says, those were my favorite. You both laugh. You're not sure why. Maybe because love is never what people expect. It's quiet, rough at the edges, more about repetition than romance. You pass him a jar of pickled beets. He pretends to gag. You say, "You'll eat them." He says, "I'll think about it." You write again that evening. Not in the ledger, not in the contract, on a scrap of parchment. Just one line. The hardest part of getting old is realizing it was always worth it. You don't fold the note. You leave it on the table. Let the firelight touch it. Let it dry in the open, just in case someone else needs to read it. The rhythm of your days settles into something gentle, not boring, just slow in the best way. You wake with the light, stretch your fingers before they'll move properly, and breathe in the smell of fresh ash from the hearth. Mira is often already up, sweeping the front step or shaking out herbs to dry. She hums when she works soft melodies that don't quite have a tune. You never ask her where she learned them. You don't need to. Some songs come from nowhere. Others come from women who had to sing something, or else they'd scream. You understand that kind of melody. Leo and Mira are building a separate shed behind the house. It's crooked, of course. Young people always forget to measure twice, but they're proud of it, so you keep your mouth shut, and your advice even quieter. They ask you for help with the ledger. They want to start tracking the animals, the seasons, the trades with neighbors. You hand it over with only one rule: don't tear out the old pages. History matters, even the messy parts, especially those. One day, Mira asks about the wax seal. She's seen you press it onto so many documents, notes, letters, little affirmations for neighbors. You show her the ring, not gold, not fancy, just iron with your family mark etched rough and deep. You say it's the only piece of jewelry I ever cared about. She tries it on. It doesn't fit, but she smiles anyway. Tomas begins forgetting things. Nothing serious at first. Where he put the spoon, what day the market meets. Then he forgets Leo's name, just for a moment. You don't mention it. Neither does he. But that night he sits a little closer on the bench. And when you stand, he rises with you. You whisper, "Still got your legs," he says. "Still got you." Historians still argue whether aging in medieval villages meant a loss of dignity or an increase in respect. Some say old women became invisible. Others say they gained strange power, feared and sought in equal measure. You think both are true. Sometimes you vanish. Other times you're the one they call when the calf won't stand or the baby won't stop crying. And through it all you keep writing, your hands slower, but steady. A scribe visits from the city, a young man all smug parchment and 2 clean boots. He asks about the land, about your documents, about the origins of your title. You show him the contract. He laughs, calls it quaint. You don't hit him. You don't even raise your voice. You just say, you don't need to believe it. You just need to recognize it. He shrugs and makes a note in his ledger. Later, Mira offers to burn his boots. You think about it, then say, no. Let him walk home in them. Some punishments are quieter. Leo draws up a new page for the household. It lists chores, harvest dates, planting schedules. You watch as he writes it, how he tests the pen against the edge of his thumb. He has your frown when concentrating. He doesn't know it yet. You hope he never stops making that face. You begin organizing your papers, not because you're planning anything, just in case. You sort them into 3 piles. What I want them to remember, what I needed to survive, what I'm not ready to part with yet. Some pages overlap. You let them. Memory is never tidy. Mira brings home a cat. Tomas names it Priest because it sits in judgment and never does any work. The name sticks. Priest follows you from room to room, sits on your papers, bats at your pen. You pretend to be annoyed, but when it curls up in your lap, one evening while you write, you don't move for an hour. You make a new pouch, not to replace the purple one, just to match it. This one is for the next contract. You haven't written it yet, but you will, because every story deserves a sequel, and every life deserves a clause that says, to be continued. You teach Mira how to seal wax. She burns her fingers twice, curses once, then gets it right. She presses the iron ring down with a confidence that surprises even her. She looks at you, seeking approval. You nod, say it'll hold, then add, so will you. That night you take out your old contract one more time. You read every word. Your eyes blur in places, but your mind remembers the shape of each sentence. You lay it flat. You place your hand over it, and then you sign again, this time just your first name in new ink. Beneath it, you write, still here. You seal it. Let it dry. Tuck it into the pouch and place it by your bedside. just in case someone needs to find it, just in case someone needs to remember who you were. Historians still argue whether individual voices ever truly survive the passage of time. You know they do, because you've written yours down over and over, in flour, in fire, in ink, in love. And now it waits, ready for whoever opens the pouch next. A late frost surprises the village. It's spring, technically, but the earth hasn't quite made peace with the calendar. The blossoms on the pear trees curl in disappointment, and Tomas swears at the sky like it owes him warmth. You wrap your shawl tighter and go out anyway. There's something defiant about planting seeds when the world still breathes cold. A way of saying, I still believe in summer. Leo and Mira are already in the garden, arguing gently over Rose. She wants straight lines. He prefers curved ones, says the earth doesn't grow in squares. You side with her, then offer them both tea, because that's what wisdom looks like. Now quiet compromise, served warm. Later that day, Mira finds you with the ledger. She asks, do you want to add something today? You nod. Not because anything monumental happened, but because the not monumental days matter too. You write, a late frost came, but we planted anyway. Mira made soup with turnips. Tomas snored louder than the thunder. I smiled. That's all. Then you draw a tiny pear blossom beside it. Your hand shakes a little, but the drawing still looks like hope. Tomas begins napping more, longer stretches. He jokes that he's training for the afterlife. You roll your eyes, but you tuck the blanket tighter around him when he dozes. Later that week, he forgets his own birthday. You don't correct him. You just bake the bread anyway. Historians still argue about the emotional lives of common people. They debate whether love existed in peasant marriages or whether it was all function survival and shared work. Let them argue. They've never seen the way Tomas pats your arm when he passes, or how he notices when you favor one knee over the other, or how he eats the parts of the stew you don't like without ever saying he noticed. That's love, not the loud kind, the kind that lingers like steam on morning bread. You begin copying your contract, not word for word, but close. You want Leo to have it eventually, not because you think he'll need it, but because you never thought you would either. And look how much it changed. You use new ink, a fresh sheet. The parchment resists at first, curling at the edges like it doubts your purpose. You weigh it down with a mug and a stone. You begin in the name of the quiet women, in the name of those who signed with thumbprints, in the name of every breath that wasn't wasted, arguing, but was spent building, mending, lifting. Your handwriting is slower, but more deliberate. You pause often, not for memory, but for reverence. This isn't just a copy, it's a conversation. Leo finds you writing and sits beside you. He says nothing, just watches. You hand him the pen. He hesitates, then writes his name beneath yours, not as a claim, but as an inheritance. Mira sews a new cover for the pouch, dark green this time. She embroiders tiny stars across the flap. You say, "Looks like the night sky before a storm." She says, "That's when you taught me the most." You don't cry, but you do reach out and take her hand and hold it longer than usual. One evening, you hear a knock. Not a visitor, a neighbor's daughter, scared, carrying nothing but her name and a bruise she won't explain. You let her in, no questions. You make her tea. You give her the quilt with the frayed corner, the one you swore you'd fix years ago, but never did. She sleeps in Leo's old bed. The next morning you begin writing again. You add her name to the ledger. You don't write her story, that's hers. You just write, "Another girl arrived. She stayed." The house got warmer. Historians still argue whether these kinds of things were allowed. Women helping each other without permission, without payment. But you don't care. You've never waited for permission to do what was right. One night, Tomas tells a story you've heard 100 times before. But this time you ask questions like it's new. You laugh at the same joke. You feign surprise at the ending. He beams like a boy who's been heard. You tuck that smile away like gold, because someday that's all you'll have, and it will be enough. You go to bed early these days. You leave the window open, just enough to hear the wind move through the grass. You fall asleep before the candle dies. Sometimes you dream of ink and wax and paper that doesn't crumble. Sometimes you don't dream at all. But every morning you wake and write one line in your head before even rising, "I am still here." And that's the truest sentence you know. The sky that morning is low and gentle, not gray, not blue, just soft, like someone brushed their thumb across it to smudge away the sun's sharpness. You sit by the door, hands wrapped around a cup of weak tea, and watch the world unfold the way it always does, quietly, stubbornly, without your permission. There's a bird on the fence, same one as yesterday. It tilts its head at you, then flits away like it knows you won't follow. You don't. You just sip and breathe and listen. Inside the house stirs. Mira chops something, turnips probably. You hear the thunk of the knife against the worn board, the steady rhythm of a woman who knows the exact strength needed to get through a root without splitting the table. Tomas coughs twice. Leo laughs from the back. Something about a pig in the wrong pen. And you let it all happen around you. Not because you're too tired to move, but because there's a deep, rare peace in simply being surrounded by life you helped build. You return to your papers later that morning, not to write, just to sort. You lay them out on the table, the original contract frayed and softened by time, the copy Leo helped you write, the ledger with all its crooked lines and thumbprints, the notes from women whose names you can no longer remember, but whose pain you still could recognize by how hard they pressed the ink. You think not for the first time that maybe this is enough legacy, not a fortune, not a monument, just documents. Proof that you were here, that you cared, that you fought quietly and without spectacle for a better line on a better page. Later, Mira brings you something new, a bundle of papers tied with a scrap of ribbon from an old dress. She says, "It's everything we've written this year." You untie it carefully. There are entries in different hands, hers, Leo's, even Tomas's notes about crops and sicknesses, and laughter and arguments, and births, and new recipes that didn't quite work. You don't read them yet. You just hold them. Feel the weight. Smell the ink. Think this is what it feels like to be understood without needing to be asked. Historians still argue what counts as real history. They look for castles and kings, battles and treaties. But you wonder quietly, because that's how you always wondered whether they'd change their minds if they ever saw this bundle. If they'd hold it like you do, see the loops of Mira's cursive, the careful corrections in Leo's entries, the smudges where Tomas's hands weren't quite dry from the garden. Maybe they wouldn't understand it, but maybe someone would. That evening, you sit by the fire. Not in your usual chair, on the floor, actually, because Priest the cat has claimed your cushion, and you no longer have the heart or spine to argue with him. So you sit on the rug, wrap yourself in a blanket, and let your joints complain a little. That's their job now. Leo and Mira bring out a bottle of something sweet. They pour small cups and toast to nothing in particular. You lift yours and say, "To contracts." They groan. You grin, then add, "And to everything we've signed without paper." That shuts them up a little, but in a good way. You tell one more story before bed. It's one you've told before about a girl who inherited a field and didn't know how to plow. So she wrote a contract that said, "The earth and I will figure this out together." Leo says, "That sounds fake." Mira elbows him. You just smile and whisper, "But she did figure it out, didn't she?" You fall asleep with the pouch on your lap, the original contract tucked inside. The wax still faintly smells of smoke. You think as you drift that you've written enough. Not because you're done, but because you finally trust someone else to write the next part. The night folds around the house like a thick wool blanket. Outside, the frost whispers through the grass, delicate and harmless. The moon hangs low, not to shine, but just to watch. A soft hush settles across the roof, as if even the air has agreed to rest. Inside, the fire dims itself, glowing just enough to remind the walls they are loved. You breathe evenly now, no urgency, no ache for tomorrow, just a calm surrender to the rhythm of your own breath. Somewhere in another room, someone turns a page. Maybe your ledger, maybe just a new chapter. It doesn't matter. Because what you've left behind isn't just a pouch or a contract or a collection of old thoughts. You've left a pattern, a thread, a way forward stitched gently into the fabric of ordinary days. A woman's name in ink. A whispered lesson in the kitchen. A seal pressed not for power, but for memory. And so the story does not end. It simply softens, fades like candlelight on parchment, settles like dust between floorboards waiting for a curious hand to find it. You rest, and the world keeps writing.